country and received care in Europe, where he lived for 3 years to recover. He came back to Tanzania in the hopes of fostering further democratic change, but on his return, he continued to face death threats. He had to leave again. President Magufuli died in office. It potentially of heart problems. There's a lot of kind of speculation about his passing, but he died. And the current president came to power, had been his vice president and came to power. So she ran for her first election in October of 2025. She was running as an incumbent because she had acceded when Magufuli had died, but this was her first time presenting for office. And really starting in 2024, you saw this incredibly disturbing uptick of some of the trends that we've talked about in the region. Disappearances documented up to 200 disappearances. Tundulisu, the opposition parliamentarian whom I mentioned, who was at that time the chairman of the leading opposition party, was charged with treason election, and then after the election, there were 6 days of really very extraordinary violence, allegations of up to thousands dying. You saw a tearing away of some of that, the mythology around the ruling party, and the idea that the government's responsibility is. Another trend that I saw that was extremely troubling when I look at Tanzania, but is highly relevant to the whole panel, is what they call transnational repression of activists across borders. So in the case of Tanzania, this opposition parliamentarian who had been jailed, Tundulisu, was supported by Ugandan and Kenyan activists who came to Tanzania to attend the hearing, to attend his trial, or that was their aspiration. What they have alleged publicly in press, you can find this online, is that they were detained while they were in their hotel rooms, they were abducted and really horrifically abused before they were eventually able to return to their countries of origin. That kind of transnational oppression on activists it has happened in Africa for a long time, but I think it's rising in a new way in East Africa. And for those of us who support democracy and human rights in East Africa and on the continent, that transnational repression offers a unique threat. Because it means people are no longer safe if they cross a border. They can no longer find refuge or a place to recover in a neighboring country, or it might be much more difficult for them to do so. So as I think about how does the international community respond, I'll mention one other threat. We talked about impunity, this shutting down of the internet during electoral periods. I know both speakers have talked about that, but that really is something that has an enormous impact because it means that we don't get the stories and the documentation out to the rest of the world to support accountability. So when I think about how do the players on the ground and how does the international community help respond to some of these troubling trends? First, I would say that, again, thinking primarily about Tanzania, we saw a few glimmers in terms of the international response, and particularly the African response immediately after the election. The Southern African Development Community, which is the regional body Tanzania is a member, did say that in most areas, voters could not express their democratic will. That may not sound radical to the folks in this room, but within the African context, for that to be part of SADC's official statement was actually a very strong position. Similarly, the African Union called out the objections, said that they called into question the legitimacies of the election. So you saw the beginning of a response from African counterparts. I think that we don't want to skip over that. Those language statements are not easily won. And I want to make sure that we remain focused on it. Even the United States, which was not particularly vocal around the time of the election itself, did announce in December of 2025 that it would be re-examining the bilateral relationship based in part on disturbing violence against civilians in the days leading up to and following Tanzania's October 29 elections. So you do see this kind of a little bit of an international recognition, and I think those of us who want to support democracy want to continue to foster those international acknowledgments when there are abuses. But I also think we need to lean into the regional space. we need to think through how can we support regional actors to support one another. Because there are many things that from this far vantage point of Washington we will not see or know. And so thinking how can we foster both the collaboration and highlight the particular threat of transnational repression as a way to try to support democratic practice in East Africa. So I have a little bit more to say about Tanzania, but truly I want to leave time for our very excellent panelists. And of course, for Bobby Wine, very, very pleased to have you join us today. So I'll hold there. Happy to take questions at the time. Thank you.
All right, thank you so much, Professor Petro. And next up we have Devin. Just going to get the mic back. And then after that we'll proceed with Mr. Keda, who is on the screen behind me, and then ultimately with Mr. Mobiwe.
Okay, I'm going to talk about Ethiopia and Somalia, but I'm going to really oversimplify things and try to be very quick so that we can move on to the very exciting things we have. So I'm going to, like I said, they would take advantage of people being out in mass to vote, and they would use that as an opportunity to conduct additional attacks. To be fair, Al-Shabaab has targeted elections even when they were conducted indirectly, but I think the consensus is generally that this would give them greater opportunities. And then another point of contention with this is that in that state, the president is viewed as someone who gets support from Ethiopia, so that can also be a part of the equation. Another major issue here is just feasibility issues. It takes a lot of work to conduct an election anywhere, but in a country like Somalia where, okay, just to give you an example, the recent local elections that they had in Mogadishu took 10,000 soldiers to provide security. So right now, the SNA has not been getting the same level of support from the United States or other partners. In fact, since January, U.S. assistance to Somalia was turned off. So, can they provide that security? That is a good question. And then there are also a lot of accusations that this is a power grab by the incumbent, right? So, Somalia has had 5 changes of leader and party in the last 5 cycles. So they're doing good at kind of making that power shift from one party to another. Maybe other countries in the region should take note. But at the same time, HSM wants to extend his time in office. He wants to change the constitution. He wants to, he got Parliament to support a measure to give him another year. And he's hoping that the direct elections are going to be more feasible in urban areas where he has more support. So, there's a lot of tension over this issue, and the conclusion is unless the federal government can come to some compromise with the federal member states, because it's not just Southwest State, right? Puntland and Jubaland are also quite not happy about this. Then we're really in for a rough year ahead in Somalia. So I think I'm going to move over to Ethiopia really quick. This is going to be the first time Ethiopia, June 1st, they're going to have national elections, parliamentary elections. It's the first national election since the end of the Tigray War. How competitive are they? There are 23 opposition parties registered, and they are forming some coalitions, which could be a good sign. However, only in 2005 did the opposition in Ethiopia ever get close to having a decent percentage of the vote. And so some have said that this is not at all a democracy, this is procedural authoritarianism, because the choice has really been eroded way ahead of the vote. Right. Of course, a point of contention is that the TPLF lost its status as a political party last year. Also, some parties are calling for a delay in the elections, but of course, thinking back to what sparked the conflict in 2021, it was the delay in the presidential elections that kind of led down a dangerous path, so we want to be careful there. Security is also a major issue for holding Ethiopian elections. So even last time, almost 100 voting districts weren't able to have voter. So this year it could be worse. This time it could be worse. They're trying to do something about it. They have a system where they show if it's green, then they can